Hello, brothers and sisters. This is Lisa, and I'm here to share some devotionals with all of you. The title is Lost and is Found, and this is part 1. And he said, A certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided unto them his living. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living. Luke 15, verses 11 through 13. The parables of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the prodigal son bring out in distinct lines God's pitying love for those who are straying from Him. Although they have turned away from God, He does not leave them in their misery. He is full of kindness and tender pity toward all who are exposed to the temptations of the artful foe. In the parable of the prodigal son is presented the Lord's dealing with those who have once known the Father's love, but who have allowed the tempter to lead them captive at his will. A certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided unto them his living. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, and took his journey into a far country. This younger son had become weary of the restraint of his father's house. He thought that his liberty was restricted. His father's love and care for him were misinterpreted, and he determined to follow the dictates of his own inclination. The youth acknowledges no obligation to his father, and expresses no gratitude, yet he claims the privilege of a child in sharing his father's goods. The inheritance that would fall to him at his father's death he desires to receive now. He is bent on present enjoyment and cares not for the future. Having obtained his patrimony, he goes into a far country, away from his father's home. With money in plenty, and liberty to do as he likes, he flatters himself that the desire of his heart is reached. There is no one to say, Do not do this, for it will be an injury to yourself, or do this, because it is right. Evil companions help him to plunge ever deeper into sin, and he wastes his substance with riotous living. And that's the end of part 1, and now for part 2. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. Romans 1, verse 22. The Bible tells of men who, professing themselves to be wise, became fools. Romans 1, verse 22. And this is the history of the young man of the parable. The wealth which he has selfishly claimed from his father, he squanders upon harlots. The treasure of his young manhood is wasted. The precious years of life, the strength of intellect, the bright visions of youth, the spiritual aspirations, all are consumed in the fires of lust. A great famine arises. He begins to be in want, and he joins himself to a citizen of the country, who sends him into the field to feed swine. To a Jew, this was the most menial and degrading of employments. The youth who has boasted of his liberty now finds himself a slave. He is in the worst of bondage, holden with the cords of his sins. Proverbs 5, verse 22. The glitter and tinsel that enticed him have disappeared, and he feels the burden of his chain. Sitting upon the ground in that desolate and famine-stricken land with no companions but the swine. He is fain to fill himself with the husks on which the beasts are fed. Of the happy companions who flocked about him in his prosperous days and ate and drank at his expense, there is not one left to befriend him. Where now is his riotous joy, stilling his conscience, benumbing his sensibilities? He thought himself happy, but now, with money spent, with hunger unsatisfied, with pride humbled, with his moral nature dwarfed, with his will weak and untrustworthy, with his finer feelings seemingly dead, he is the most wretched of mortals. What a picture here of the sinner's state! Although surrounded with the blessings of his love, there is nothing that the sinner, bent on self-indulgence and sinful pleasure, desires so much as separation from God. Like the ungrateful son, he claims the good things of God as his by right. He takes them as a matter of course, and makes no return of gratitude, renders no service of love. As Cain went out from the presence of the Lord to seek his home, as the prodigal wandered into the far country, so do sinners seek happiness in forgetfulness of God. Romans 1 verse 28. And that is the end of part 2, and now for part 3. Thus saith the Lord, Cursed be the man that trusteth in man, and maketh flesh his arm, and whose heart departeth from the Lord. Jeremiah 17 verse 5. Whatever the appearance may be, every life centered in self is squandered. Whoever attempts to live apart from God is wasting his substance. He is squandering the precious years, squandering the powers of mind and heart and soul, and working to make himself bankrupt for eternity. The man who separates from God, that he may serve himself, is the slave of mammon. The mind that God created for the companionship of angels has become degraded to the service of that which is earthly and bestial. This is the end to which self-serving tends. If you have chosen such a life, you know that you are spending money for that which is not bread, and labor for that which satisfieth not. There come to you hours when you realize your degradation. Alone in the far country you feel your misery, and in despair you cry, O wretched man that I am! Who shall deliver me from the body of this death? Romans 7 verse 24. It is the statement of a universal truth which is contained in the prophet's words, Cursed be the man that trusteth in man, and maketh flesh his arm, and whose heart departeth from the Lord. For he shall be like the heath in the desert, and he shall not see when good cometh, but shall inhabit the parched places in the wilderness, in a salt land and not inhabited. Jeremiah 17 verses 5 and 6. God maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust. Matthew 5 verse 45. But men have the power to shut themselves away from sunshine and shower. So while the sun of righteousness shines, and the showers of grace fall freely for all, we may, by separating ourselves from God, still inhabit the parched places in the wilderness. And that is the end of part 3, and now for part 4. And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want. And he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine, and he would fain have filled his belly with the husks that the swine did eat. And no man gave unto him. And when he came to himself, he said, How many hired servants of my father's have bread enough to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and will say unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants. Luke 15, verses 14 through 19. The love of God still yearns over the one who has chosen to separate from him, and he sets in operation influences to bring him back to the Father's house. The prodigal son in his wretchedness came to himself. The deceptive power that Satan had exercised over him was broken. He saw that his suffering was the result of his own folly, and he said, How many hired servants of my father's have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father. Miserable as he was, the prodigal found hope in the conviction of his father's love. It was that love which was drawing him toward home. So it is the assurance of God's love that constrains the sinner to return to God. The goodness of God leadeth thee to repentance. Romans 2, verse 4. A golden chain, the mercy and compassion of divine love, is passed around every imperiled soul. The Lord declares, I have loved thee with an everlasting love. Therefore, with loving kindness have I drawn thee. Jeremiah 31, verse 3. The son determines to confess his guilt. He will go to his father, saying, I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. But he adds, showing how stinted is his conception of his father's love, Make me as one of thy hired servants. The young man turns from the swine herds and the husks and sets his face toward home. Trembling with weakness and faint from hunger, he presses eagerly on his way. He has no covering to conceal his rags, but his misery has conquered pride, and he hurries on to beg a servant's place where he was once a child. Little did the thoughtless youth, as he went out from his father's gate, dream of the ache and longing left in that father's heart. When he danced and feasted with his wild companions, little did he think of the shadow that had fallen on his home. And now, as with weary and painful steps he pursues the homeward way, he knows not that one is watching for his return. But while he is yet a great way off, the Father discerns his form. Love is of quick sight. Not even the degradation of the years of sin can conceal the Son from the Father's eyes. He had compassion and ran and fell on his neck in a long, clinging, tender embrace. And that is the end of part 4, and now for part 5. And he arose and came to his father, but when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him, and had compassion, and ran, and fell on his neck, and kissed him. And the son said unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven, and in thy sight, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. But the father said to his servants, Bring forth the best robe, and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand, and shoes on his feet. And bring hither the fatted calf, and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead, and is alive again. He was lost, and is found. And they began to be merry. Luke 15, verses 20 through 24. The Father will permit no contemptuous eye to mock at his Son's misery and tatters. He takes from his own shoulders the broad, rich mantle and wraps it around the Son's wasted form, and the youth sobs out his repentance, saying, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. The Father holds him close to his side and brings him home. No opportunity is given him to ask a servant's place. He is a son who shall be honored with the best the house affords, and whom the waiting men and women shall respect and serve. The Father said to his servants, Bring forth the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring hither a fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead, and is alive again. He was lost, and is found. And they began to be merry. In his restless youth, the prodigal looked upon his father as stern and severe. How different his conception of him now! So those who are deceived by Satan look upon God as hard and exacting. They regard him as watching to denounce and condemn, as unwilling to receive the sinner so long as there is a legal excuse for not helping him. His law they regard as a restriction upon men's happiness, a burdensome yoke from which they are glad to escape. But he whose eyes have been opened by the love of Christ will behold God as full of compassion. He does not appear as tyrannical, relentless being, but as a father longing to embrace his repenting son. The sinner will exclaim with the psalmist, Like as a father pitieth his children, so the Lord pitieth them that fear him. Psalm 103, verse 13. And that is the end of these devotionals. For now, I will come back to finish parts 6 through 10. And I'll see you in the next video. God bless. Bye-bye.